Franz Kafka died convinced he was a failure. His closest friend promised to burn everything he'd written. Instead, those pages became some of the most influential literature of the 20th century, reshaping how we understand alienation, bureaucracy, and the absurdity of modern existence. But the man who wrote them spent his entire life trapped between impossible choices, never quite belonging anywhere. Prague in 1883 was a city of fractures. The Austro-Hungarian Empire ruled it, but Czechs formed the majority. Germans held power and prestige. Jews navigated between both worlds, speaking German to climb socially while living among Czechs who often resented them. Into this divided city, on July 3rd, Franz Kafka was born in a cramped apartment near the Old Town Square. His father, Hermann, had clawed his way up from rural poverty through sheer force of will, building a successful business selling fancy goods. His mother, Julie, came from a more educated, prosperous family. The marriage was typical for ambitious Jewish families of the time, merging drive with respectability. Hermann Kafka dominated the household like a natural force. Loud, physical, impatient, he had survived brutal conditions to achieve middle-class security and expected gratitude, not weakness. He worked long hours in his shop, came home exhausted, and had no patience for a sensitive, bookish son who seemed afraid of everything. Franz was the eldest child, and only surviving son after two younger brothers died in infancy. 3 sisters followed, Gabriele, Valerie, and Ottilie. But the weight of his father's expectations fell entirely on Franz. The apartment sat above the shop, so business concerns invaded every moment. Hermann's voice boomed through the rooms, giving orders, berating employees, commanding attention. Julie worked in the business too, leaving Franz and his sisters largely to servants and governesses. Later, Kafka would describe his childhood as emotionally abandoned, the parents physically present but utterly absent in any meaningful way. He felt like an intruder in his own home. School offered no refuge. The German language gymnasium he attended was academically rigorous, designed to produce loyal imperial subjects. Franz was a good student, diligent and obedient, but he moved through his education like someone fulfilling a sentence. He made few friends. His German was perfect, marked by the formal precision that would later define his prose, but he spoke it as a minority language in a Czech city, never quite at home. He learned Czech, but not fluently enough to feel truly connected to the majority culture surrounding him. This linguistic limbo would mark him forever. What he discovered during these years was literature. Reading became an escape, a private world where he could exist without his father's judgment or the confusion of Prague's ethnic tensions. He consumed everything: German classics, Czech writers, French novels, philosophy. Writing started as diary entries, fragments of observation, attempts to capture the strangeness he felt watching the world. Words on paper didn't shout or demand. They waited patiently. They could be shaped and controlled. At 18, he enrolled at the German Charles Ferdinand University in Prague, initially studying chemistry before quickly switching to law. The choice was practical, not passionate. Law offered a respectable career, financial security, the kind of success Hermann could understand. Philosophy or literature, Franz's true interests, would have seemed frivolous, a betrayal of everything his father had sacrificed. So law it was, a decision that would trap Kafka in a double life for the rest of his days. University introduced him to a wider world of ideas. He attended lectures on philosophy, art history, and German literature, alongside his legal studies. More importantly, he met Max Brod, a meeting that would prove the most consequential friendship of his life. Brod was everything Kafka wasn't: confident, socially adept, prolific, optimistic about his own literary talents. He recognized something extraordinary in the withdrawn law student who occasionally shared fragments of his writing. Brod became Kafka's champion, advocate, and ultimately the man who would defy his dying wish. The friendship circle expanded to include Felix Welch and Oscar Baum, intellectual young men navigating the same fractured identity as Jews in Prague. They met in cafes, the Café Arco becoming their regular haunt, discussing literature and philosophy while the city moved around them. These conversations gave Kafka something he'd never had: peers who took his ideas seriously, who didn't dismiss his sensitivities as weakness. But even as this intellectual life flourished, the practical demands closed in. In 1906, Kafka completed his doctorate in law. He had no interest in practicing, but jobs had to be found. He spent a miserable year at an Italian insurance company, the Assicurazioni Generali, working long hours evaluating claims in an environment he found suffocating. The bureaucracy was maddening, the work meaningless, the hours consuming everything. He could barely find time to write. His health, never robust, began deteriorating under the stress. Then in 1908, a better position opened at the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute, a semi-governmental body that investigated workplace injuries and set insurance premiums. The work was still bureaucratic, still tedious, but the hours were better, ending at 2 p.m. This schedule would become crucial. Kafka could work his official job, fulfill his obligations to respectability and his father's expectations, then return home to write in the evenings and through the night. The split was exhausting, but it was the only way he could inhabit both worlds. His work at the Institute was actually competent, even innovative. He wrote clear, precise reports about industrial accidents, investigated dangerous working conditions, and contributed to safety reforms that probably saved lives. His colleagues respected him. His superiors valued his careful attention to detail. But Kafka experienced it as a form of death. 8 hours daily, drained from the only life that mattered to him. Every promotion felt like a tightening noose. The writing that emerged during these stolen hours was unlike anything being produced in German literature. His early stories were strange, unsettling, marked by a flatness of tone that made their nightmarish content even more disturbing. Characters found themselves in impossible situations described with bureaucratic precision. The ordinary world operated by rules that made no sense, yet everyone pretended everything was normal. Reading Kafka's drafts, Brod recognized genius, but even he couldn't always understand what his friend was attempting. In 1912, everything changed. At Max Brod's home, Kafka met Felice Bauer, a young woman visiting from Berlin. She was practical, modern, working as a representative for a dictation machine company. She had none of Kafka's tortured sensitivity. The attraction was immediate and completely irrational. Within weeks, Kafka began writing letters to her, tentative at first, then increasingly frequent, sometimes multiple times a day. The correspondence became an obsession, a relationship conducted almost entirely through words on paper. What Kafka wanted from Felice remains mysterious, possibly mysterious even to him. He proposed marriage, then panicked about the commitment. He needed her absolutely, then felt suffocated by her existence. He wanted a wife who would support his writing, but feared that marriage would destroy the solitude writing required. His letters veered between passionate devotion and cold withdrawal, constructing elaborate theories about why they should or shouldn't be together. Felice, practical and patient, tried to understand this strange man, who seemed to love her and flee from her simultaneously. That same year, on the night of September 22nd into September 23rd, Kafka sat down and wrote The Judgment in a single 8-hour session. The story poured out of him completely formed, a son destroyed by his father's verdict, leaping from a bridge to his death. When Kafka finished at 6 a.m, he felt he'd achieved something unprecedented in his own work, a perfect unity of form and content. He dedicated it to Felice. The breakthrough continued. Within weeks, he began the Metamorphosis, the story that would become his most famous work. Gregor Samsa wakes one morning transformed into a monstrous insect, and his family's response moves from shock to inconvenience to barely concealed relief when he finally dies. The premise is absurd, impossible, yet the story's emotional truth about family obligation and human disposability cuts deeper than realism ever could. Kafka wrote it while living in his parents' apartment, his father's voice booming through the walls, interrupting the work constantly. The story's claustrophobia wasn't invented, but even as his writing reached new heights, the conflict tore at him. He wanted marriage, stability, normalcy. He also knew these things would kill whatever made the writing possible. His engagement to Felice became official, then was broken off, then resumed, then broken again. His health worsened, headaches and insomnia becoming constant companions. The insurance work ground on, consuming his mornings, leaving his afternoons and nights for the only work that mattered. By 1914, Europe was sliding toward catastrophe, though few recognized it yet. Kafka, at 31, had published a few stories in small literary magazines. Max Brod praised him extravagantly to anyone who would listen. But Kafka remained virtually unknown, a minor writer working a government job, trapped in an engagement that terrified him, living in his parents' apartment, writing stories about trapped men that nobody read. Everything he'd written, he considered fundamentally flawed, unfinished, failures that should probably be destroyed. The war that was about to engulf Europe would transform everything, shattering the empire he'd grown up in and pushing his writing toward even darker visions of human powerlessness. But before that transformation could occur, Kafka had to navigate the collapse of his engagement and confront what he really wanted from life. The answer, when it came, would surprise no one who knew him. He wanted to write. Everything else was compromise, obligation, the price paid for the hours stolen from sleep and sanity, to put words on paper that captured something true about existence that no one else seemed able to express. The man who would one day be called Prophetic, whose visions of faceless bureaucracy and absurd authority would define modern alienation, was still just an insurance clerk in Prague, unknown, unhealthy, convinced of his own failure. The greatest work was still ahead, waiting to be written in the narrowing gap between his day job and his deteriorating body's capacity to stay awake. The war arrived in August 1914, and with it came a strange clarity. While Europe tore itself apart, Kafka's personal battles suddenly seemed smaller, almost absurd in their domesticity. The Habsburg Empire mobilized. Young men from Prague's streets marched east toward Russian guns or south toward Italian mountains. Kafka, 31, and medically unfit for service, remained at his desk in the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute, processing claims for injuries that now included missing limbs and shrapnel wounds. His engagement to Felice had dissolved again, this time seemingly for good. The relief was immense and crushing in equal measure. He'd failed at normalcy, at becoming the conventional man his father wanted, the husband Felice deserved, but the failure freed him. The energy spent on guilt and obligation could return to writing. In October 1914, he began the trial. Joseph K. wakes on his 30th birthday to find himself arrested. The crime is never specified. The court is everywhere and nowhere, operating from attics and tenement buildings, its procedures incomprehensible, its authority absolute. K fights his case, hires lawyers, seeks intercessions, but every attempt to understand the system only entangles him deeper. A year later, on the eve of his 31st birthday, two men arrive. They lead him to a quarry and execute him. Like a dog, he thinks as he dies. Kafka wrote it during night shifts of fevered concentration, sometimes in cafes to escape his apartment's noise, sometimes in his sister's empty house. The novel poured out in fragments, chapters written out of sequence, the ending clear from the beginning, even as the middle sections sprawled and multiplied. Unlike his earlier work, this wasn't a story. It was a system, a trap built from words. Every reader who encountered the trial in later years would recognize something. The absurd authority that requires obedience without explanation, the guilt assigned before any crime, the punishment seeking its justification retroactively. Kafka was mapping something that didn't yet have a name, a kind of power that the 20th century would perfect. But he couldn't finish it. By 1915, the manuscript sat abandoned, hundreds of pages complete, but unresolved. The problem wasn't the ending, which he'd known from the start. The problem was that he couldn't find the shape, couldn't see how all the fragments cohered. So he set it aside and returned to shorter works, stories that could be completed in single sessions. In the Penal Colony emerged from this period, perhaps his most disturbing creation. An explorer visits a prison camp where executions are carried out by an elaborate machine that inscribes the condemned man's sentence directly onto his body with needles, writing the judgment into flesh over 12 hours until death arrives. The officer explaining the machine is devoted to it with religious fervour. When the machine is finally deemed obsolete, he places himself inside it, but the mechanism malfunctions, simply murdering him rather than transcribing anything. The apparatus breaks down. Violence without meaning. Kafka read this story aloud to friends in November 1916. They sat in stunned silence. Even Max Brod, his most enthusiastic supporter, found it almost unbearable. What was Kafka trying to say? That justice is torture? That systems of punishment are inherently meaningless? That authority's only real function is inflicting pain? Kafka didn't explain. He rarely did. The stories meant what they meant. Interpretation was someone else's problem. His health continued its slow deterioration. Headaches became migraines. Insomnia became chronic. He developed stomach problems, digestive issues that made eating difficult. His body was staging its own kind of rebellion, refusing the conditions under which he forced it to operate. Then in July 1916, something unexpected happened. He met a woman who understood. Felice Bauer had been all wrong for him, wanting conventional marriage and children and bourgeois comfort. But Felice had introduced Kafka to her friend Julie Vorazek, and Julie was different. She worked as a secretary, came from a modest background, and seemed to accept Kafka's strangeness without trying to cure it. They began spending time together, walks along the river, quiet conversations. Nothing dramatic, nothing intense, just companionship. By 1919, they were engaged. Kafka was 36. This time felt different. Julie didn't demand transformation. She accepted his writing, his late hours, his peculiarities. They found an apartment. The wedding date was set. Kafka's father destroyed it in an afternoon. Hermann summoned his son for a conversation. What followed was a systematic demolition of the engagement, the woman, and Kafka's judgment. Julie came from nothing. Her family was disreputable. The marriage would embarrass the Kafkas. Hermann forbade it. Franz was 36 years old, employed, self-supporting. He didn't need permission, but he couldn't disobey. The engagement ended. Years later, Kafka would write a 100-page letter to his father that was never delivered, an attempt to explain the damage Hermann had inflicted. You asked me recently why I claim to be afraid of you. As usual, I had no answer. Partly, it's because I am in fact afraid of you, and partly because the basis of this fear involves so many details that I couldn't marshal them coherently in speech. The letter, known now as Letter to His Father, is devastating in its clarity. Kafka describes a childhood dominated by Hermann's contempt, his mockery, his physical presence that made young Franz feel weak and insignificant. Every criticism, every dismissive comment about Franz's friends or interests or ambitions had accumulated into a fundamental sense of inadequacy. Hermann represented the father, authority incarnate, and Franz had internalized that authority until it spoke with his own voice, judging him, finding him wanting, preventing any action that might lead to independence or happiness. Hermann never read it. Kafka gave it to his mother to deliver, and she, recognizing the destruction it would cause, simply kept it. Father and son continued their dance of resentment and dependence, but something had shifted. The collapse of the engagement to Julie marked a turning point. Kafka stopped trying to become normal. If marriage was impossible, if his father's judgment was inescapable, if his body was failing and his job was meaningless, then all that remained was the work. In late 1916, he'd rented a tiny house on Alchemist's Lane, a narrow street of miniature dwellings built into the walls of Prague Castle. The house was barely large enough for a bed and desk, unheated, primitive. His family thought he was insane. But there, in that cramped space, he could write without interruption. No voices through walls, no obligations, no presence except his own and the blank page. The output increased, stories multiplied. A country doctor arrived in a single night, hallucinatory and strange, about a physician summoned to treat a patient whose wound contains flowers and worms and who finds himself trapped, unable to escape the sick room or return home. Jackals and Arabs explored tribal hatred through animal metaphor. The bucket rider imagined a man so poor he flies through the sky on an empty coal bucket, begging for fuel, ignored unto death. These weren't realistic stories. They existed at angles to reality, dreamlike but precise, following their own logic to conclusions that felt inevitable and inexplicable simultaneously. Critics later would struggle to categorize them. Expressionist, surrealist, existentialist, the labels never quite fit. They were Kafkaesque, a word that wouldn't exist until after his death, but would prove impossible to avoid. His employment at the Insurance Institute continued, but barely. He'd developed tuberculosis, though the diagnosis wouldn't come until 1917. The coughing fits, the night sweats, the blood he sometimes found on his pillow in the morning, these he attributed to nerves, to exhaustion, to anything but the disease that was actually killing him. When the diagnosis finally arrived in September 1917, Kafka felt something close to relief. The body had provided an excuse. He took medical leave from the institute, left Prague, and moved to the countryside to recover. The recovery never came. Tuberculosis in 1917 was a death sentence, just one that might take years to execute. He moved between sanatoriums and small towns, seeking cleaner air, better conditions, some environment that might slow the progression. His sister Ottla joined him sometimes, providing companionship and care. She was the only family member he trusted completely. The only one who seemed to understand that his strangeness wasn't defiance but necessity. In Surreal, a tiny village where Ottla managed a farm, Kafka spent 8 months in something approaching peace. He helped with farm work when strength permitted, wrote in notebooks, read philosophy. The aphorisms he composed there, short philosophical fragments, revealed a mind trying to make sense of existence itself. The meaning of life is that it stops. You can hold back from the suffering of the world. You have permission to do so, and it is in accordance with your nature. But perhaps this very holding back is the one suffering you could avoid. But illness was rewriting the terms of his life. The Insurance Institute granted extended leave, then more leave, then finally a pension. At 40, Kafka was officially an invalid. His career over, his income reduced to a small government stipend. He should have felt defeated. Instead, he felt liberated. For the first time since childhood, he had time. Days stretched out with no obligations except survival. He could write when energy permitted, rest when it didn't, live according to his body's demands rather than the clock's tyranny. The writing that emerged from this period was different. Darker, more abstract, pushing further from conventional narrative. He began The Castle, a novel about a land surveyor summoned to work for mysterious authorities who remain forever inaccessible. The protagonist, known only as K, tries repeatedly to reach the castle, to understand his assignment, to make contact with the officials who supposedly need his services. Every attempt fails. The village below the castle operates according to rules no outsider can comprehend. K remains trapped in administrative limbo, neither dismissed nor employed, neither welcomed nor expelled, simply existing in permanent uncertainty. The novel sprawled across hundreds of pages, chapter after chapter, of K's increasingly absurd efforts to penetrate the bureaucratic maze. Kafka wrote it in fragments, returning to it intermittently over years, never finding an ending. How could it end? The system was designed to be interminable. Between sanatoriums, he returned to Prague occasionally, staying with family, seeing old friends, observing how the empire he'd grown up in was disintegrating. The war had ended in 1918 with Austria-Hungary's collapse. Czechoslovakia emerged from the rubble, a new nation built from the empire's Slavic territories. Prague was suddenly a capital city. Czech the official language, the German-speaking minority no longer dominant but tolerated. Kafka, fluent in both languages, belonged fully to neither community. He was a German-speaking Jew in a Czech nation, part of a culture that was evaporating even as he documented it. His Prague, the multilingual imperial city of his youth, was becoming memory. His last years brought unexpected happiness in the form of Dora Diamant. She was 25 when they met in 1923. Kafka was 40, dying, his body skeletal from tuberculosis and the strict diets various doctors had prescribed. Dora was everything Felisa Bauer wasn't: intellectually curious, uninterested in convention, willing to live in poverty if it meant freedom. They moved together to Berlin, renting 2 rooms, living on Kafka's meagre pension, surviving the hyperinflation that was destroying Germany's economy. They were happy. For the first time in his life, Kafka lived with someone who loved him without demanding he become someone else. Berlin in 1923 was starving. Kafka and Dora arrived just as Germany's currency collapsed into hyperinflation, so extreme it became surreal. A loaf of bread cost billions of marks. Workers needed wheelbarrows to carry their daily wages. Prices changed by the hour. People burned money for heat because it was cheaper than buying firewood. The economic structure of reality itself seemed to be disintegrating, which made it the perfect setting for Kafka's final months. They rented 2 small rooms in the Steglitz district. Kafka wrote at a tiny table while Dora cooked whatever food they could afford on his pension, which arrived from Prague in Czech crowns and bought less each week as the marks spiraled into worthlessness. They heated one room, wore layers indoors, and pretended they'd chosen this poverty as an aesthetic experiment rather than having it forced upon them by his dying body and Germany's dying economy. But something shifted in Kafka during these months. The anxiety that had paralysed him for decades loosened its grip. He wrote to friends describing himself as happy, actually using that word without irony or qualification. Dora read his manuscripts and understood them. She laughed at the dark humour others missed. She didn't try to fix him or improve him or convince him to reconcile with his father or get a proper job or stop being so obsessed with his own neuroses. She simply existed alongside him while he wrote and coughed and slowly died. He worked on The Burrow, a story narrated by an animal, species unspecified, who has spent its life constructing an elaborate underground fortress. The creature is consumed by fear of invasion, constantly improving its defences, listening for enemies, second-guessing every architectural decision. It ventures above ground briefly, then rushes back to check if anything has been disturbed. The burrow is simultaneously the creature's masterpiece and its prison, the thing it created to feel safe, but which has become the source of endless anxiety. Was it secure enough? Had he overlooked a vulnerability? The story has no resolution. just the creature's mind spinning through infinite permutations of fear. The metaphor was obvious, even to Kafka. The burrow was his writing, his elaborate system of defences against the world, the thing he'd spent his life constructing and could never finish because no amount of revision could eliminate every possible flaw. But recognizing the pattern didn't free him from it. He continued revising, continued worrying, continued trying to make something perfect enough to justify its existence. By early 1924, his larynx was deteriorating. Tuberculosis had spread there, making swallowing painful, then agonizing. Eating became torture. His weight dropped until he looked skeletal. Dora fed him ice cream because it slid down easier than solid food, but even that hurt. Doctors recommended a sanatorium near Vienna that specialized in laryngeal tuberculosis. He went reluctantly, knowing what it meant, but unwilling to surrender yet. The sanatorium was called Kierling, a small facility outside Vienna run by a doctor named Hugo Hoffmann, who developed treatments for throat tuberculosis. The treatments were useless. Kafka arrived in April 1924 and immediately began starving because he couldn't swallow. The staff tried liquid nutrition, but his throat closed around anything attempting to pass through. His body consumed itself. Max Brod visited and found his friend wasting away, barely able to whisper. Kafka was correcting proofs for A Hunger Artist, a story about a professional faster who starves himself in a cage as public entertainment. The crowds lose interest, the impresario abandons him, and the hunger artist continues fasting in obscurity until he's discovered nearly dead. His final confession is that he fasted because he never found any food he liked. If he'd found it, he would have eaten like everyone else. The story was Kafka's entire relationship with existence, compressed into 15 pages. He couldn't participate in normal life, not because he was morally superior, but because nothing about it appealed to him. And now, he was literally starving to death, while correcting a story about someone who starved by choice. Dora stayed with him constantly, sleeping in a chair beside his bed, reading to him when his eyes were too tired, moistening his lips when he could no longer drink. Robert Klopstock, a young medical student Kafka had befriended at a previous sanatorium, also came to help. The two of them watched him disappear day by day, his body consuming muscle and organ tissue for fuel, his voice fading to barely audible whispers, then to gestures, then to scribbled notes. On one of those notes he wrote, "Killing me or letting me live, you are both murderers." It wasn't clear who he was addressing. The doctors, maybe, or God, or simply the universe that had constructed reality in a way that made his continued existence impossible. Another note, "More morphine, or it is not fair." The pain in his throat had become constant, but morphine depressed respiration, which was already compromised. Too much would kill him faster. The doctors tried to balance his agony against extending his life by hours or days. Kafka wanted the morphine. What difference did a few more hours make when they'd be spent in torture? He died on June 3rd, 1924, 1 month before his 41st birthday. The cause of death was listed as laryngeal tuberculosis, but really it was starvation. His throat had closed completely, and his body had nothing left to consume. Dora was with him at the end, holding his hand while he suffocated and starved simultaneously. His last recorded words, written on a scrap of paper, were, "I think we ought to have only such books as bite and sting us." The funeral took place in Prague on June 11th. His body was brought by train from Vienna, accompanied by Dora and Klopstock. The service was held at the Jewish Ceremonial Hall in Prague's new Jewish cemetery. Dozens attended, friends and family, colleagues from the Insurance Institute, members of Prague's German-speaking literary circle. His father Hermann was there, 71 years old, watching his son's coffin lowered into the ground. What he thought about it, whether he felt guilt or vindication or simple sadness, was never recorded. Kafka was buried beside his mother, who died during the war. A simple headstone marked the grave. No epitaph, no literary quotes, just his name and dates. He'd wanted his work destroyed, all of it, published and unpublished, burned so completely that nothing remained. He told Max Brod this repeatedly, most explicitly in a letter written in 1921. "Everything I leave behind me is to be burned unread." He repeated the instruction in his final weeks at Keeling, making Brod promise to destroy the manuscripts. Brod had already decided to ignore him. He loved Kafka too much to let the work disappear, and respected him too little to obey a request Brod considered pathological self-hatred rather than genuine artistic judgment. Within months of the funeral, Brod began preparing Kafka's unpublished novels for publication. The Trial came first in 1925, then The Castle in 1926, then America in 1927. Brod edited them minimally, mostly just organising the fragments into something resembling finished narratives and adding explanatory notes about what was missing or unresolved. The response was immediate but limited. German-speaking literary circles recognised something extraordinary in the posthumous novels, a voice unlike anything in contemporary literature. But these were fragmentary, unfinished texts published by small presses for specialised audiences. Kafka remained obscure, known mainly to other writers and critics. He'd published a few thin volumes during his lifetime that sold poorly. Now he was a dead author whose unpublished fragments were being released against his explicit wishes. It seemed like a footnote to literary history, interesting but minor. What nobody anticipated was how the world would change in ways that made Kafka's nightmares look prophetic. Within a decade of his death, the political landscape of Europe began transforming into something that resembled his fiction far too closely. Bureaucracies expanded their power. Individuals became interchangeable units in vast administrative systems, and the gap between official procedures and human justice widened into an abyss. In 1933, the Nazis took power in Germany. They immediately began constructing a totalitarian state that operated through precisely the kind of impenetrable bureaucracy Kafka had described. Jews were stripped of citizenship through administrative decree. People were arrested and detained without trial or explanation. Individuals found themselves accused of crimes they couldn't understand by authorities they couldn't reach, their guilt determined by ethnic categories rather than actions, their appeals vanishing into procedural mazes that had no exit. Kafka's three sisters still lived in Prague. Ottla, Vali and Eli watched as Czechoslovakia's independence dissolved and Nazi Germany absorbed their country. The Jewish population, which had lived in Prague for 1,000 years, was systematically catalogued, restricted, and eventually deported. All three sisters were sent to concentration camps. All three were murdered. Ottla died in Auschwitz in 1943. Vali and Eli died in Łódź Ghetto in 1942 and 1944. The bureaucratic precision with which their deaths were organised and documented would have been familiar to anyone who'd read In the Penal Colony. Max Brod escaped. When the Nazis invaded Czechoslovakia in 1939, he fled to Palestine carrying a suitcase stuffed with Kafka's manuscripts. He spent the rest of his life in Tel Aviv, promoting Kafka's work, publishing more fragments, writing a biography, and defending his decision to disobey his friend's final wish. Without Brod's betrayal, Kafka's work would have been destroyed twice, once by his own instruction, again by the Nazis who burned Jewish books. After the war, Kafka's reputation exploded. The Trial and The Castle were suddenly legible in ways they hadn't been in the 1920s. Readers who'd lived through totalitarianism recognized the world Kafka described. The arbitrary arrests, the impenetrable bureaucracies, the individual crushed by systems that operated according to internal logic no outsider could penetrate. These weren't surreal fantasies anymore. They were documentary realism, French existentialists claimed him as one of their own, seeing in his work the absurdity of existence and the impossibility of meaning. Albert Camus wrote that Kafka's entire output could be summarized in one question: can one live in a world without meaning? Jean-Paul Sartre read The Metamorphosis as a parable about the freedom and horror of recognizing you're not what others expect you to be. Kafka became required reading for anyone trying to understand the philosophical dimensions of modern alienation. Literary critics developed entire careers analyzing his symbolism, his narrative techniques, his use of parable and allegory. What did the court represent? The castle? The insect? Interpretations multiplied. Psychological, religious, political, existential. Kafka became an adjective. Kafkaesque entered multiple languages as shorthand for nightmarish bureaucracy, absurd regulations, the individual trapped in systems designed to make navigation impossible. But something was lost in this canonization. Kafka, the tormented genius, the prophet of totalitarianism, the symbol of modern alienation. These versions obscured Kafka, the insurance lawyer, who wrote meticulous reports about workplace safety. Kafka, the friend who was funny and generous. Kafka, the man who was genuinely happy during his final year with Dora despite dying in poverty. The literary monument replaced the person. His work was translated into dozens of languages, taught in universities, adapted for theatre and film, analysed in thousands of academic papers. The quiet insurance clerk who wrote in his spare time and published almost nothing became one of the most influential writers of the 20th century. His fragmentary, unfinished novels were treated as sacred texts. His diaries and letters were published and scrutinized for biographical insight. Every scrap he wrote was preserved and studied. The irony would have amused and horrified him. He wanted everything destroyed specifically because he knew it was imperfect, unfinished, not ready for public judgment. He spent his life revising and doubting and trying to achieve perfection he knew was impossible. And now the fragments he considered failures were being treated as masterpieces, taught to students, held up as models of literary achievement. His worst fear had come true. People were reading his unfinished work and finding it brilliant. The question of what Kafka actually believed has puzzled readers for a century. His work resists simple interpretation, which is precisely why it generates endless analysis. Every reading feels partially correct and completely inadequate. Take The Trial. Joseph K. is arrested but never told his crime. He spends the novel trying to navigate a legal system that operates according to rules he cannot access. The court exists in attics and tenement buildings. Lawyers are corrupt or incompetent. Judges are petty bureaucrats. Evidence doesn't matter because guilt is assumed. The process is the punishment. Is this about totalitarianism? Kafka died before the rise of fascism and Stalinism, but he'd lived through the Austro-Hungarian Empire's Baroque bureaucracy and witnessed the arbitrary power structures of early 20th century Europe. The novel captures something essential about how modern institutions function. They claim rationality while operating through opacity. They promise justice while delivering only procedure. Or is it religious allegory? Kafka grew up Jewish in a Catholic city within a secular empire. The court could represent divine judgment, inaccessible and absolute, operating according to laws humans cannot comprehend. Joseph K.'s search for acquittal becomes a search for grace or meaning in a universe that offers neither explanation nor mercy. But there's another reading. The Trial is psychological horror about guilt that precedes accusation. Joseph K. feels guilty before he knows what he's accused of. His guilt generates the court rather than the court generating his guilt. The novel becomes an externalization of internal anxiety, the way shame and self-judgment manifest as persecuting external forces. All three readings work simultaneously. That's the problem and the genius. The castle operates similarly. K arrives in a village to take up a position as land surveyor. The castle that employs him looms over the village, but remains perpetually inaccessible. K spends the novel trying to gain entry, to confirm his appointment, to speak with someone in authority. He never succeeds. The bureaucracy produces endless paperwork about his case, but no actual resolution. Messengers arrive with contradictory information. Officials claim to help, but accomplish nothing. Is the castle God? The political establishment? The father? Kafka's own father? Hermann loomed over his life, exactly like the castle looms over the village, simultaneously present and unreachable, powerful and indifferent. Kafka's relationship with Hermann shaped everything he wrote. His letter to his father, 70 pages written in 1919 and never sent, is one of the most devastating documents in literature. Kafka catalogues every way his father crushed him. Mockery of his physical weakness, dismissal of his writing, contempt for his sensitivity, casual cruelty disguised as humour. Hermann Kafka was a successful merchant who'd clawed his way up from rural poverty through force of will. He valued strength, business acumen, social conformity. His son was physically frail, impractical, obsessed with literature. Hermann saw Franz as a failure. Franz internalized that judgment completely. The letter tries to explain their dynamic, to achieve understanding, if not reconciliation. But halfway through, Kafka does something extraordinary. He imagines his father's response, writing it himself in Hermann's voice. And the imagined response is devastating because it's completely reasonable. Hermann would point out that Franz had every advantage: education, freedom, financial support. He could have done anything. Instead, he wrote strange stories nobody wanted to publish and complained about how difficult his life was. Kafka gives his father the better argument. The letter becomes a demonstration of why communication is impossible. Both perspectives are valid. Both are trapped in their own logic. Understanding doesn't produce resolution. This is the pattern in all of Kafka's work. Characters are guilty and innocent simultaneously. Authority is legitimate and illegitimate. Rebellion is necessary and pointless. The contradictions don't resolve because they're the point. His romantic relationships followed similar patterns. He got engaged to Felisa Bauer twice and broke it off twice. He loved her and found the prospect of marriage terrifying. He wrote her hundreds of letters, many of them desperate pleas for connection, others explaining why connection was impossible. He needed solitude to write, but solitude made him miserable. He needed companionship, but companionship destroyed his ability to work. With Milena Chesenska, the pattern intensified. She was brilliant, married, and became the great love of his life, precisely because the relationship was impossible. They met rarely. Most of their relationship existed in letters. She understood his work better than anyone, and he could write to her with complete honesty about his fears, his health, his sense of being fundamentally broken. When she offered to leave her husband and be with him, he panicked and withdrew. The possibility of actual life together destroyed the purity of the impossible longing. Only with Dora Diamant in his final year did something shift. She was 19 when they met. He was 40 and dying. Maybe the imminence of death made commitment possible. Maybe she was young enough not to carry expectations he'd inevitably fail. Whatever the reason, their year together in Berlin was apparently happy. They were poor, he was sick, Germany was collapsing into hyperinflation and political chaos, and yet the letters from this period describe genuine contentment. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Did Kafka need his misery? Was his unhappiness the source of his art, or its consequence? If he'd been happy earlier, would he have written these particular works? The biographical fallacy is tempting with Kafka because the work feels so personal, so clearly drawn from his own anxieties and obsessions. The Metamorphosis was written during his first engagement to Felice, when he felt trapped between the demands of family life and the demands of his art. Gregor's transformation into an insect makes him simultaneously the family's burden, and freed from their expectations, he's destroyed by the transformation and liberated by it. But reducing the story to autobiography makes it smaller than it is. Yes, Kafka felt like an insect in his own family, but the story works because everyone has felt that alienation, that sense of being fundamentally other, of discovering that the people closest to you see you as a problem to be solved or managed rather than a person to be understood. The image of Gregor on the ceiling, clinging upside down, is the perfect visual representation of estrangement. The space he inhabits is the same space his family inhabits, but his relationship to it is inverted. They cannot occupy the same room the same way anymore. Physical proximity makes the psychological distance more absolute. Kafka's technique magnifies this effect. His prose is clean, precise, almost bureaucratic. Extraordinary events are described in the same flat tone as mundane details. Gregor wakes up, transformed into an insect. This is stated as simple fact. The family's response is practical concern about his job, about the locked door, about maintaining appearances for the lodgers. Nobody asks why this happened because in Kafka's world, asking why is pointless. The absurd is simply the condition of existence. This refusal of explanation is what makes the work inexhaustible. Kafka doesn't tell you what it means. He presents the situation and lets the horror and absurdity speak for themselves. Interpretation is left to the reader, and every interpretation reveals something about the reader's own anxieties. The religious readings see divine absence. The political readings see totalitarian power. The psychological readings see family dysfunction. The existential readings see the human condition. All are present because Kafka built structures that contain multitudes. His influence on later writers is incalculable. Borges learned from Kafka's compressed parables how to build labyrinths in a few pages. Camus and Sartre found in him the absurdist vision they'd systematize philosophically. Gabriel Garcia Marquez credited Kafka with showing him that you could write about impossible things in a matter-of-fact tone and create magic realism. Haruki Murakami's entire aesthetic descends directly from Kafka's combination of mundane detail and inexplicable strangeness. In Eastern Europe, writers who lived under communist regimes recognized Kafka as a realist. The bureaucracies he described weren't nightmares. They were documentary accounts of daily life under totalitarianism. The absurdity wasn't surreal. It was literally how the system functioned. Kafka had somehow described a political reality that didn't exist yet when he wrote, but became the defining experience of millions. This is what makes him prophetic. Not that he predicted specific political systems, but that he captured the logic of how modern power operates. The trial's court doesn't need to be efficient or just. It only needs to perpetuate itself. The accusation creates the guilt. The process becomes its own justification. Kafka understood that modern systems don't need conspiracy or evil intention to destroy individuals. The banal operation of bureaucratic procedure is sufficient. His work also influenced film, particularly the paranoid thrillers of the 1960s and 70s. The protagonist trapped in a system he doesn't understand, pursued by forces whose motives are unclear, unable to find anyone in authority who'll explain what's happening. This is the structure of dozens of films, from Orson Welles' adaptation of The Trial, to The Conversation, to Brazil, to The Matrix. The Kafkaesque became a visual language. Even people who've never read Kafka know his scenarios because they've been absorbed into the culture. The nightmare bureaucracy that won't let you speak to anyone in charge. The accusation you can't defend against because you don't know what you're accused of. The authority that's simultaneously omnipotent and incompetent. These situations are instantly recognizable as Kafkaesque. His letters and diaries published after his death added another dimension. They revealed the daily struggle behind the work, the constant doubt, the physical suffering from tuberculosis, the emotional suffering from his own psychology. The diaries are brutal in their self-examination. He catalogues his failures, his inability to finish things, his sense of fraudulence. This vulnerability made him even more compelling to later generations. The modernist image of the artist as heroic genius gave way to a more fragmented conception, and Kafka became the model, brilliant and broken, producing masterpieces while convinced of his own inadequacy. The commodification of Kafka would have disgusted him. Prague now markets him as a tourist attraction. You can buy Kafka t-shirts, coffee mugs, refrigerator magnets. His face appears on advertisements. The city that barely acknowledged him during his life now claims him as its most famous son. Tours visit his childhood home, his father's shop, the street where he wrote The Judgment in a single night. There's something perfectly Kafkaesque about this transformation. The writer who felt like an outsider in his own city, who published almost nothing and wanted everything destroyed, becomes a brand. The quiet insurance lawyer becomes a commodity. The man who couldn't finish a novel has his unfinished novels treated as complete artistic statements. Max Brod's decision to publish against Kafka's wishes created this entire phenomenon. Without that betrayal, there would be no Kafka industry, no Kafkaesque, no influence on 20th century literature. The insurance files would have survived. The novels would have been burned. Was Brod right? He violated his friend's explicit instructions, but he preserved work that has meant something profound to millions of readers. He made a decision that Kafka, trapped in his own perfectionism and self-doubt, couldn't make for himself. The ethical question has no clean answer, which is appropriate for Kafka's legacy. Brod's betrayal was simultaneously wrong and necessary. Respecting Kafka's wishes would have been loyal and tragic. The contradiction sits there, unresolvable, exactly like the contradictions in Kafka's fiction. But there's one more chapter to this story. After Kafka's death and Brod's preservation of his work, after the Nazi period and the posthumous fame, after the canonization and the academic industry, something unexpected happened. Kafka's unfinished novels began to look less like failures and more like a new form entirely. The incompleteness itself became meaningful. Critics began arguing that The Trial, The Castle, and America weren't incomplete at all. They were formally revolutionary, deliberately rejecting the closure that traditional novels demanded. The abrupt endings, the missing chapters, the unresolved plot threads weren't signs that Kafka failed to finish. They were the point. This interpretation gained traction through the 1960s and 70s as postmodern theory developed. Roland Barthes declared the death of the author, arguing that texts have no fixed meaning and readers create significance through their own interpretations. Under this lens, Kafka's unfinished novels became perfect postmodern objects. They refuse to tell you what they mean. They deny you resolution. The incompleteness forces the reader to sit with ambiguity, which is exactly what life requires. The Castle demonstrates this most clearly. Kay arrives in a village dominated by a castle administration he can never reach. He tries every strategy: official channels, personal connections, seduction, manipulation. Nothing works. The bureaucracy remains impenetrable. In traditional narrative structure, Kay would eventually succeed or definitively fail. He'd reach the castle or be expelled from the village. The story would resolve, but Kafka's version just stops. Kay is still trying, still blocked, still caught in the machinery, and that's the reality. Most of our struggles don't conclude. They just continue until we die or give up. Max Brod added a note to the published version explaining that Kafka had told him how the castle was supposed to end. Kay would receive word on his deathbed that he could stay in the village, but only due to a technicality, not because his claim was legitimate. This would have been a devastating conclusion, but many readers and critics now argue the novel is stronger without it. The absence of ending makes the absurdity more complete. Kay's struggle becomes eternal, which reflects the human condition more honestly than any resolution could. The same logic applies to the trial. Joseph K is arrested but never told his crime. He spends the novel trying to navigate a legal system that's simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. Lawyers, judges, and court officials appear in attics and tenement buildings. The law operates through hidden channels. No one can explain the procedure. Kay's execution at the end comes suddenly, almost casually. Two men take him to a quarry and stab him. His last words, "like a dog." The novel has structure and an ending, but the central mystery remains unsolved. What was the crime? What was the trial actually about? Kafka never tells us because that's the point. The accusation is everything. The specifics don't matter. You're guilty because the system says so. Academia built entire careers on Kafka interpretation. The novels could be read as religious allegory, psychological case study, political critique, existential philosophy, or formal experiment. Every reading found textual support because the work is genuinely ambiguous. Kafka wasn't being deliberately obscure as a stylistic trick. He was representing consciousness honestly. We don't understand why things happen to us. We don't know what authorities want. We navigate systems we can't comprehend, using strategies that may be completely pointless. That's the human situation, and Kafka's unfinished novels capture it by refusing to provide the false comfort of explanation. But while academics debated interpretations, something else was happening. Kafka's influence was spreading beyond literature into film, music, visual art, and eventually into the language itself. The word Kafkaesque entered common usage, describing a specific type of nightmare. You know it when you encounter it. The bureaucracy that requires Form 27B before they can tell you what Form 27B is. The customer service system that transfers you endlessly without solving your problem. The insurance claim denied for reasons that contradict the policy language. The legal notice about a violation you didn't commit, with no clear process for appeal. These experiences feel Kafkaesque because Kafka articulated something true about modern institutional life. The systems meant to serve us often seem designed to frustrate us, and the frustration feels intentional even when it's just incompetence. Orson Welles adapted The Trial in 1962, casting Anthony Perkins as Joseph K. The film opens with a parable Kafka wrote separately, Before the Law, animated by Alexandra Alexeyev. A man seeks entrance to the law, but is blocked by a doorkeeper who tells him he cannot enter yet. The man waits his entire life. As he's dying, he asks why no one else has sought entrance. The doorkeeper replies that this door was meant only for him, and now it will be closed. Wells understood that this parable contains the entire logic of Kafka's world. The law exists but remains inaccessible. The barrier is simultaneously real and arbitrary. The man's obedience to the doorkeeper is what traps him, but disobedience might not have worked either. Terry Gilliam's Brazil drew heavily on Kafka while creating a dystopian bureaucracy that's both totalitarian and incompetent. The Ministry of Information tortures people, but also makes clerical errors that doom innocent citizens. The protagonist, Sam Lowry, gets caught in the machinery while trying to correct a mistake. The system can't be fixed because the dysfunction is the system. This vision of technological bureaucracy as simultaneously powerful and idiotic comes directly from The Trial and The Castle. David Lynch's films, particularly Eraserhead and Lost Highway, create Kafkaesque atmospheres without direct adaptation. Lynch understood that Kafka's power comes from dream logic applied to waking life. Objects and events follow emotional causation rather than rational sequence. The feeling is right even when the narrative doesn't make conventional sense. This approach influenced generations of filmmakers who wanted to represent psychological states rather than just tell stories. In music, Kafka's influence appears in unexpected places. Patti Smith's album Horses includes Birdland, a song inspired by Peter Reich's memoir about his father, Wilhelm Reich. But the structure echoes Kafka's A Report to an Academy. Philip Glass composed an opera based on In the Penal Colony. Radiohead's music videos and album artwork frequently reference Kafkaesque imagery. Faceless bureaucracies, transformed bodies, oppressive systems. Tom York has cited Kafka as an influence on the band's approach to alienation and modern anxiety. Visual artists found Kafka's work endlessly adaptable. The illustrator Peter Cooper created graphic novel versions of several stories, using wordless sequences to convey the claustrophobia and disorientation. Anselm Kiefer's massive installations evoke Kafka's themes through scale and material, using lead and ash to represent weight and destruction. The photographer Dwayne Michaels created a sequence called The Unfortunate Man that translates Kafka's transformation narratives into photographic terms. But perhaps the strangest manifestation of Kafka's influence came through the internet age. The experience of navigating digital bureaucracy, of being trapped in automated phone systems, of having your account locked for security reasons you can't verify, of receiving contradictory instructions from different representatives. All of this feels designed to produce Kafkaesque frustration. The systems are more sophisticated than anything that existed in Kafka's time, yet the experience is identical. You can't reach a human. No one has authority to help. The rules change without notice. Your problem is simultaneously unique and impossible to address. Social media added another layer. The experience of being accused online, of watching a mob form based on incomplete information, of having no effective way to respond because the accusation itself is the evidence. This is pure Kafka. The trial happens in public. Everyone has an opinion. No one knows the full context. The accused is guilty because they're accused. Defending yourself proves you're guilty because an innocent person wouldn't need to defend themselves. The logic is circular and inescapable. Kafka anticipated surveillance culture without having experienced it. The trial presents a world where everyone is potentially an informant, where private spaces don't exist, where the court's reach extends into bedrooms and boarding houses. We now live in that world voluntarily. We carry devices that track our location, record our conversations, and monitor our behavior. We agree to terms of service we don't read, granting corporations access to our data. The panopticon Foucault described, where people modify their behavior because they might be watched, is now implemented through technology. Kafka saw it coming. His influence on later writers is equally pervasive. Gabriel Garcia Marquez's magical realism owes a debt to Kafka's matter-of-fact treatment of impossible events. When Garcia Marquez describes a woman ascending to heaven while folding sheets, he's using Kafka's technique of presenting the fantastic as mundane. Haruki Murakami explicitly acknowledges Kafka as a primary influence. His novel Kafka on the Shore takes its title and many of its themes directly from Kafka's work. Murakami's protagonists exist in worlds where normal logic doesn't apply, where they slip between realities, where cats talk and fish fall from the sky, all described in the same calm prose Kafka used for Metamorphosis and Starvation. Don DeLillo's paranoid systems, Thomas Pynchon's conspiracies, David Foster Wallace's institutional nightmares, all trace back to Kafka. The sense that invisible forces control our lives, that we're embedded in systems we can't comprehend, that the more we learn, the less we understand. This is Kafkaesque thinking, applied to contemporary America. Wallace's The Suffering Channel reads like a Kafka story, transplanted to the internet age. Pynchon's bureaucracies in Gravity's Rainbow are direct descendants of Kafka's castle administration. W.G. Sebald, the German writer who became a British citizen, created a unique fusion of fiction, memoir, history, and photography that channels Kafka's approach to memory and guilt. Sebald's narrators wander through landscapes haunted by the past, encountering documents and images that may or may not be reliable. The uncertainty about what's real, the sense that your history is simultaneously present and inaccessible, comes from Kafka's influence. Coetzee's novels, particularly Life and Times of Michael K., engage directly with Kafka. Michael K. is a simple man caught in a civil war, trying to survive without understanding the larger forces destroying his world. The novel's refusal to explain the political situation, its focus on Michael K.'s limited comprehension, deliberately echoes Kafka's technique of staying inside a consciousness that can't grasp its own predicament. But Kafka's influence extends beyond writers who acknowledge him. The entire mode of contemporary alienation literature derives from his work. Whenever a character feels disconnected from society, trapped in systems they didn't create, unable to communicate their experience to others, that's Kafka's legacy. The loneliness of modern life, the sense that everyone else understands rules you don't, the suspicion that you're fundamentally different and that this difference is shameful. Kafka articulated these feelings with such precision that they became a template. His personal life, revealed through the published letters and diaries, added another dimension to his influence. The letters to Felice Bauer, his on-and-off fiancée, show a man terrified of marriage, convinced it would destroy his ability to write, yet desperately lonely and seeking connection. He broke off their engagement twice. The letters are painful to read because Kafka is simultaneously pushing her away and begging her to stay, creating an impossible situation where neither choice can work. The letter to his father, written in 1919 but never delivered, is a 100-page attempt to explain their relationship. Kafka catalogues every moment of childhood fear, every instance where his father made him feel inadequate, every way the father's personality crushed the son's development. But the letter also acknowledges that this is just Kafka's perspective, that his father would have a different story, that the truth lies somewhere in between. The letter is therapy conducted on the page, an attempt to understand the formation of his own psyche. It's also a masterpiece of prose, turning personal grievance into universal statement about parent-child dynamics. These personal documents influenced how later generations thought about the relationship between life and work. The romantic idea that suffering produces art became more complicated. Kafka's suffering didn't ennoble him or make him a hero. It just made him miserable and also happened to produce extraordinary writing. The two things existed in parallel, neither justifying nor explaining the other. This more complex understanding of artistic production, where genius and neurosis coexist without redemptive meaning, became standard in post-war literature. The irony is that Kafka, who felt like a failure, who wanted his work destroyed, who published almost nothing during his lifetime, became one of the most influential writers of the 20th century. His sense of inadequacy was completely wrong by any external measure. But it was also what enabled the work. The doubt, the revision, the inability to finish, these weren't obstacles to greatness. They were the source. The posthumous publication created a strange situation. Kafka's instructions to Max Brod were clear: burn everything. But Brod decided that preserving the work mattered more than honouring his friend's wishes. This raises an uncomfortable question. Was Brod right? Artists frequently destroy their own work or request its destruction. Emily Dickinson asked for her poems to be burned. Virgil wanted the Aeneid destroyed because it was unfinished. Brod's decision established a precedent that the public's interest in art outweighs the artist's explicit instructions. You can argue this either way. On one hand, we have The Trial, The Castle, America, masterpieces that would have been lost. On the other hand, Kafka's autonomy was violated. He made a clear request, and it was ignored. The fact that the violation produced something valuable doesn't necessarily justify it. This dilemma appears throughout literary history now. Sylvia Plath's husband, Ted Hughes, controlled her estate and published work she might not have wanted public. Philip Larkin's executors published his letters despite his wishes. The pattern repeats every time. The justification is the same. The work is too important. But importance to whom? Not to the person who created it and asked for its destruction. The situation becomes even more complex with Kafka because his unfinished state is part of what makes the novels powerful. The trial doesn't have an ending. We don't know definitively what happens to Joseph K. beyond his execution, which Kafka wrote, but which doesn't feel like a conclusion to the novel's logic. The castle simply stops. K never reaches the castle, never gets the explanation he seeks. These aren't endings, they're interruptions, but the interruption is thematically perfect. A novel about bureaucratic frustration that literally cannot be completed mirrors its own content. Did Kafka intend this? Probably not, consciously. He was just stuck, unable to figure out how to finish, but the accidental form became inseparable from the meaning. This influenced how later writers thought about structure. The idea that incompletion could be a valid artistic choice rather than a failure gained traction. David Foster Wallace's The Pale King was unfinished at his death and was published as fragments. The novel is about boredom and the difficulty of paying attention, and its fragmentary form reinforces that theme. Would Wallace have wanted it published? His estate decided yes, following the broad precedent. Roberto Bolaño's 2666 was published posthumously, according to his instructions, but he died before final revisions. The published version is what he left, rough edges and all. These decisions happen now because Brod made his decision in 1924. Kafka's influence on philosophy is less discussed but equally significant. Existentialism claimed him as a precursor. Camus wrote about the myth of Sisyphus and connected it to Kafka's vision of absurd labour. Sisyphus eternally pushing a boulder uphill is Joseph K. eternally navigating the court system, K. eternally trying to reach the castle. The labour is meaningless but continues anyway because there's no alternative. Sartre saw in Kafka the revelation of human freedom and its terrifying burden. When there are no clear rules, no accessible authority, no guidance, you're forced to choose without knowing whether the choice is correct. This freedom isn't liberating, it's paralyzing. You're responsible for decisions you're not equipped to make. Kafka showed this decades before existentialist philosophy formalized it. Walter Benjamin wrote an essay on Kafka that tried to locate him within Jewish mystical tradition. Benjamin argued that Kafka's world is one where revelation has been withdrawn. The law exists but can't be known. God exists but can't be reached. This isn't atheism. It's a world where the divine presence has become inaccessible, leaving humans in a state of permanent theological frustration. Benjamin's reading influenced how critics approached Kafka. The novels weren't just about bureaucracy, they were about the absence of transcendent meaning in modernity. The castle isn't just an administrative building, it's a stand-in for any ultimate authority that should provide answers, but remains forever distant. Theodor Adorno took a different approach, seeing Kafka as diagnosing late capitalism, the impersonal systems, the reduction of humans to case numbers, the way power operates through procedure rather than visible force. These were features of modern economic and political organization. Kafka had captured how domination works in bureaucratic society. You're not oppressed by a tyrant you can fight. You're oppressed by forms, by waiting rooms, by officials who are themselves just following orders. Hannah Arendt connected Kafka to totalitarianism. She argued that his novels predicted the administrative machinery of Nazi and Soviet systems. The banality of evil, her famous phrase about Eichmann, applies to Kafka's bureaucrats. They're not monsters, they're functionaries doing their jobs, and that's what makes them terrifying. These philosophical interpretations keep multiplying because Kafka's work is inexhaustible. You can read it as Jewish theology, as existentialism, as Marxist critique, as psychological case study, as language philosophy. All of these readings are valid because the text doesn't close them off. The ambiguity isn't a weakness. It's structural openness that allows each generation to find new meanings. In contemporary culture, Kafkaesque became shorthand for bureaucratic nightmares and absurd situations. When people say something is Kafkaesque, they usually mean dealing with unhelpful customer service or confusing regulations. This is a diminishment. The term gets applied to minor frustrations, but it also shows how deeply Kafka penetrated collective consciousness. His name became an adjective describing a specific type of experience. Not many writers achieve that. Orwellian is another example. Dickensian is a third. These adjectives indicate that the writer captured something so precisely that we needed their name to describe it. The TV series, The Office, both British and American versions, owes a debt to Kafka. The soul-crushing tedium, the pointless procedures, the bosses who create problems rather than solving them, the sense that you're trapped in a system designed to waste your life, that's Kafka translated into workplace comedy. The humour in The Office comes from recognition. We've all experienced versions of this. Charlie Kaufman's films, particularly Synecdoche, New York, are deeply Kafkaesque. The protagonist tries to create a perfect theatrical representation of life and becomes trapped in infinite regress. The play requires a set that includes the theatre where the play is being performed, which requires another set, which requires another, endlessly. It's K trying to reach the castle, Joseph K trying to understand the charges. The goal recedes infinitely. Video games discovered Kafka. The Stanley Parable is explicitly about choice and determinism. You play an office worker following or defying a narrator's instructions, discovering that every choice leads to another layer of control. Papers, Please puts you in the role of a border checkpoint inspector in a fictional totalitarian state. You process paperwork, make split-second decisions about who to admit, deal with impossible rules that change daily. It's Kafka as game mechanics. These adaptations show the work's flexibility. Kafka translates into different media because the core experience isn't tied to prose fiction. It's about the structure of certain situations. Any medium can represent those structures. His influence on other Jewish writers who came after the Holocaust is particularly significant. Kafka died in 1924, before the full horror. But he'd captured something about European Jewish experience that became unbearably relevant. The sense of being accused without knowing the crime, of living under laws you can't understand, of facing authority that can destroy you for reasons never explained. All of this described Nazi persecution with prophetic accuracy. Paul Celan, the great post-Holocaust poet, absorbed Kafka's influence. Celan's poetry is compressed, difficult, refusing easy meaning. Its language traumatized by history, trying to speak what can't be spoken. The impossibility of communication in Kafka becomes, in Celan, the impossibility of poetry after Auschwitz. Primo Levi's If This Is a Man describes the concentration camp as a bureaucratic system. Prisoners had numbers, not names. There were rules, but the rules were arbitrary and designed to dehumanize. Guards followed procedures. The whole apparatus of murder was administrative. Levi doesn't mention Kafka, but the description evokes him. The difference is that Kafka imagined this abstractly. Levi survived it. Art Spiegelman's Mouse, the graphic novel about the Holocaust, uses animal metaphors that create Kafkaesque distance. Jews are mice, Germans are cats, Poles are pigs. The transformation into animals echoes Gregor's transformation in the Metamorphosis. Both use non-human forms to represent dehumanization. Israeli writer Aharon Appelfeld wrote novels where Holocaust survivors live in a perpetual state of bewilderment. They can't understand what happened to them or how to live afterward. The world makes no sense. Authority is suspect. Safety is impossible. These are Kafka's themes transplanted into post-war reality. The connection between Kafka and the Holocaust is uncomfortable because it risks making real atrocity seem like fulfillment of literary prophecy. The Holocaust wasn't a metaphor, it was mass murder, but the fact remains that Kafka's imagination anticipated structures of persecution that would later become reality. This doesn't mean he predicted the Holocaust, it means he understood something about modernity and power that proved grimly accurate. His tuberculosis, the disease that killed him, appears in the work symbolically. The body breaking down, becoming alien, betraying the self, this is Gregor's transformation. It's also what TB does, the body consuming itself from inside. Kafka was diagnosed in 1917. He spent his final years in sanatoria, trying various treatments, knowing he was dying. The last story, A Hunger Artist, is about a performer who fasts professionally, wasting away in a cage while crowds watch. Eventually, people lose interest. The hunger artist dies forgotten. Before dying, he admits he fasted only because he never found food he liked. It's a parable about art and also about Kafka's body, voluntarily or involuntarily refusing sustenance, disappearing. He died in June 1924 near Vienna, away from Prague, in the care of a doctor friend. He was 40 years old. The death was slow and painful. TB of the larynx made swallowing impossible. He starved while his body filled with infection. The suffering was immense and pointless, like his character's suffering. Max Brod, despite or because of disobeying Kafka's instructions, spent the rest of his life promoting the work. He edited the novels, published the diaries and letters, wrote a biography. Brod's own writing is forgotten now. He's remembered only as Kafka's friend and literary executor. This is ironic since Brod considered himself the more successful writer during their lifetimes. He published more, earned more money, received more recognition, but history inverted their positions completely. Kafka became canonical, Brod became a footnote. The lesson is that literary reputation is unpredictable. Success during your lifetime means nothing. What matters is whether the work continues speaking to new generations. Kafka's work keeps speaking because the situations he described haven't disappeared. Bureaucracy has expanded. Alienation has intensified. Technology created new forms of impersonal control. The feeling of being trapped in systems you didn't design and can't escape is more common now than in 1924. Smartphones track your location. Algorithms determine what you see. Terms of service agreements bind you to conditions you never read. You're Joseph K., accepting charges you don't understand. Contemporary surveillance capitalism is Kafkaesque in the precise sense. Companies collect data about you constantly. This data determines your insurance rates, your credit score, your job prospects. The process is invisible. You can't opt out. You can't see your file. You can't correct errors. If something goes wrong, there's no one to appeal to. Just automated systems and customer service scripts. This is the court in the trial, distributed across servers. China's social credit system takes it further. Behavior is monitored and scored. Low scores restrict your freedom. The criteria are opaque. The surveillance is total. It's the castle made real, an invisible authority controlling your life through incomprehensible rules. Kafka didn't predict these specific technologies, but he understood the logic. Once systems become complex enough, they stop serving human needs and start perpetuating themselves. The people running the systems become servants of the system. Everyone is trapped. That's what makes Kafka permanently relevant rather than historically interesting. He's not describing the past, He's describing structural features of modern existence that keep intensifying. Every new technology of control, every additional layer of administration, every expansion of surveillance makes his work more rather than less applicable. The question people ask is whether Kafka would recognize our world or be horrified by it. The answer is both. He'd recognize it immediately because he already described it. The horror would come from seeing how much further it's gone. In his stories, the nightmare was that you might be arrested without knowing why, or turned into an insect, or starved in a cage. These were metaphors. Now the metaphors are becoming literal implementations. Consider facial recognition. You walk down a street, cameras identify you. Your movements are logged. This data feeds into systems making decisions about you, where you can go, what you can buy, whether you're a security risk. You don't consent to this. You can't see what's being recorded. You have no idea what conclusions are being drawn. It's Kafkaesque surveillance made concrete. Or take content moderation on social platforms. Your account gets suspended. You don't know why, you appeal. An algorithm reviews your appeal in seconds and denies it. You ask for human review. The human is following a rubric they didn't create, interpreting rules they don't fully understand, working under time pressure that prevents actual judgment. They deny your appeal. You're banned. No further recourse exists. You've been through a trial that wasn't a trial, judged by a court that isn't a court for a crime that isn't defined. Medical insurance claim denials follow the same pattern. Automated systems reject your treatment. The rejection uses medical coding you can't decipher. You appeal. Someone who never examined you reviews your file for 3 minutes and upholds the denial. The doctor who actually knows your case has no power. The system's logic is invisible. You can't argue with it because you can't understand it. You just know you're denied. This is why Kafkaesque became an adjective in every language. It names something we all experience but couldn't articulate before. The feeling of being caught in processes that are simultaneously absurd and inescapable. Of knowing you're being judged by standards you can't access. Of facing bureaucratic authority that functions perfectly while producing insane results. But there's another dimension to Kafka's relevance. Beyond the institutional nightmares, he understood psychological ones. The self-loathing, the inability to act, the guilt without cause. These are contemporary afflictions. Anxiety disorders are epidemic. Depression is the leading cause of disability worldwide. People feel paralyzed, inadequate, trapped in their own heads. They relate to Gregor Samsa waking up transformed into something disgusting, not because they think they're literally insects, but because they feel that way about themselves. Kafka's characters want to be normal but can't figure out how. They watch other people navigate life successfully and feel like aliens observing a foreign species. This is the experience of social anxiety, of imposter syndrome, of feeling fundamentally wrong in ways you can't name. His fiction validates these feelings not by offering solutions but by depicting them with absolute precision. Reading Kafka, people think, someone else felt this. I'm not uniquely broken. The hunger artist who starves because he never found food he liked speaks to anyone who's rejected what society offers and found nothing to replace it with. The officer in the Penal Colony who dies in his own torture machine represents anyone destroyed by systems they themselves perpetuated. The father in The Judgment who suddenly becomes enormous and condemns his son to death captures the way authority figures can turn monstrous without warning. These aren't historical curiosities, they're X-rays of the human condition under modernity. That condition hasn't improved. If anything, the pressure has increased. We're more connected, but more isolated, more productive, but more exhausted, more free in theory, but more controlled in practice. The contradictions Kafka depicted have intensified. His influence on literature was immediate and permanent. Writers absorbed his techniques, the nightmare logic, the matter-of-fact tone describing impossible situations, the bureaucratic horror, the guilt and paralysis. These became tools in the modernist toolkit. Gabriel Garcia Marquez wrote magical realism, where impossible things happen naturally. That's Kafkaesque structure. Thomas Pynchon wrote about characters trapped in vast conspiracies they can't comprehend. That's Kafka's paranoia scaled up. Philip K. Dick wrote about reality becoming uncertain and identity dissolving. That's Kafka's existential terror in science fiction form. Haruki Murakami writes about ordinary people slipping into strange alternate worlds. That's the metamorphosis, repeated endlessly in different keys. In film, directors recognized his work as inherently cinematic. Orson Welles tried adapting The Trial and created a nightmare of architectural spaces and looming authority. Terry Gilliam made Brazil, which is Kafka filtered through Monty Python. The Coen brothers films are Kafkaesque repeatedly. Baron Fink, about a writer trapped in a hotel. A Serious Man, about a man whose life collapses for no reason. Even comedy absorbed him. Catch-22 is Kafka's military bureaucracy made satirical. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy features Vogon bureaucrats, who are Kafka's officials in space. The phrase Catch-22 itself describes Kafkaesque logic, rules that trap you by their internal contradictions. But Kafka's deepest influence might be on how we think and talk. Before him, we lacked language for certain experiences. Now we have a vocabulary. When something is needlessly complicated, we call it Kafkaesque. When authority is arbitrary and impersonal, that's Kafkaesque. When you're trapped by rules that make no sense, Kafkaesque. The word entered every major language because it names something universal. This is rare. Most writers create works that matter. A few create techniques that influence other writers. Almost none create concepts that change how entire cultures think. Shakespeare did it. Freud did it. Marx did it. Kafka did it. He gave us a way to understand experiences we were having but couldn't name. The irony is that Kafka wanted none of this. He didn't want publication. He didn't want fame. He wanted his work destroyed. If his instructions had been followed, we wouldn't be discussing him. There would be no Kafkaesque. The novels would have been burned, the diaries lost, the letters destroyed. He'd be completely forgotten. Max Brod's betrayal was the most productive literary betrayal in history. By disobeying his friend's wishes, he preserved work that defined 20th century literature and changed how we understand modern life. This raises ethical questions. Did Brod do the right thing? He violated explicit instructions from a dying man. That's a serious betrayal of trust. But he preserved masterpieces that have illuminated human experience for millions of readers. There's no clean answer. Kafka had the right to control his work, but the work itself has value beyond his intentions. Art, once created, takes on life independent of its creator. It belongs to readers as much as to the writer. Brod chose readers over Kafka. He chose posterity over friendship. You could argue either way whether that was justified. What we know is the consequence. Kafka's fiction survived and became foundational. 3 unfinished novels, dozens of stories, thousands of pages of diaries and letters. Not much compared to prolific writers, but every word is essential. Nothing is wasted. The prose is perfect in its precision. Reading Kafka, you feel the presence of someone who thought harder about every sentence than most writers think about entire books. His perfectionism meant he published little during his lifetime. Only a few small volumes. Most people hadn't heard of him when he died. The reputation came posthumously, built slowly through the 30s and 40s, accelerating after World War II when his nightmares seemed prophetic. The Holocaust and the gulags made Kafka look like a realist. What seemed like surreal exaggeration in 1924 looks like documentary in 1945. The arbitrary arrests, the invisible crimes, the guilt without cause, the systematic dehumanization. These weren't metaphors anymore. They were history. Kafka became the writer who saw it coming, who understood totalitarianism before it fully existed. That's not quite accurate. He wasn't predicting specific political systems. He was examining the logic of modern power, but the misreading was productive. It made people take him seriously. Post-war intellectuals recognized his work as essential testimony about the 20th century. His reputation solidified. By the 60s, he was canonical, required reading, a major figure. Now, a century after his death, the assessment is secure. Kafka is among the most important writers of the modern era. Not the most popular. His work is too difficult, too disturbing for mass audiences. Not the most influential on immediate successors. Joyce and Proust had bigger impacts on the next generation. But the most prophetic about where modernity was heading. The one who understood earliest, and most clearly, what it feels like to be human in administered society. His style has been imitated endlessly, but never successfully duplicated. You can write Kafkaesque fiction, but you can't write like Kafka. The precision is too exact, the tone too distinctive. Imitations feel like parody. The original remains inimitable. What makes him permanently relevant is that the conditions producing his nightmares haven't disappeared. They've intensified. Bureaucracy is larger. Technology enables new forms of control. Alienation is deeper. The feeling of powerlessness more widespread. Every decade makes Kafka more rather than less contemporary. Students reading the Metamorphosis in classrooms today don't need footnotes explaining the historical context. The story is immediately comprehensible. Waking up transformed into something disgusting and being rejected by your family that resonates across time and culture. So does being arrested for unknown crimes or trying to reach an authority that remains forever inaccessible. These are permanent features of human experience under certain conditions. The conditions Kafka described are still here. Therefore, Kafka remains essential. His work functions as both warning and diagnosis. It shows what happens when systems become more important than people, when rules matter more than justice, when process replaces purpose. There's no solution in the stories, no way out, no redemption. That's part of their honesty. Kafka didn't believe in happy endings or moral lessons. He believed in depicting reality as accurately as possible. His reality was nightmarish, so his fiction is nightmarish. But the nightmare is so precisely rendered that it becomes beautiful. The prose is elegant even when describing horror. The logic is perfect even when depicting absurdity. Reading Kafka is uncomfortable. It should be. He's not trying to entertain. He's trying to show you something true about existence that you prefer not to see. Most people look away. They find his work too depressing, too strange, too difficult. But those who stay with it discover something valuable. Not comfort, but recognition. Not answers, but better questions. His characters never escape. Gregor dies as an insect. Joseph K is executed. K never reaches the castle. The hunger artist starves. The officer dies in his machine. This is Kafka's vision. We're trapped in situations we didn't choose and can't escape. Struggling only makes it worse. Understanding changes nothing. The nightmare continues regardless. Yet somehow, the fiction isn't nihilistic. It's humanistic in a dark way. By depicting the nightmare so precisely, Kafka validates our experience of it. He's saying, "You're not crazy. The world really is like this. Your feelings of helplessness and absurdity are appropriate responses to an actually helpless and absurd situation." That's a strange kind of comfort, but it's real. A century after his death, we're still trying to understand Kafka, still finding new meanings in the work, still arguing about interpretations. The fiction remains inexhaustible because it's not encoding specific messages, it's creating situations that resonate differently for each reader and each era. As long as people feel trapped, guilty, inadequate, or controlled by incomprehensible systems, Kafka's work will speak to them, which means it will matter as long as modernity continues. The man who wanted his work destroyed created something indestructible. The obscure insurance clerk became immortal. The writer who felt like a failure produced masterpieces. That's the final Kafkaesque irony. He succeeded by every measure he claimed not to care about, while failing at the only thing he said he wanted, to be forgotten. The Insurance Institute where Kafka worked still exists in Prague. You can visit the building. There's a small plaque now. Tourists take photos. The bureaucracy he described, the one that ground him down for 16 years, outlasted him by a century and counting. The files he processed, claims for workplace injuries, recommendations for safety improvements. These survived in archives. Researchers have studied them. His reports were clear, precise, humane. He was good at the job he hated. That's the split that defined him. Competent at what he despised, uncertain about what he loved. The day job funded the night work. The night work made the day job unbearable. Neither was optional. He needed both, and both were destroying him. His apartment on Golden Lane, the tiny house built into the castle wall where he wrote in isolation, is now a museum gift shop. You can buy Kafka mugs and t-shirts. The city that ignored him alive markets him dead. This would have disgusted him and also seemed perfectly logical. The absurdity is appropriate. The commodification is inevitable. Systems always win. But the work escaped. That's what matters. The novels and stories exist independent of the tourist industry, the academic conferences, the critical interpretations. You can still read them directly. The prose is still precise. The nightmares still function. New readers discover them and recognize their own lives. A teenager dealing with family dysfunction reads The Metamorphosis and thinks, that's exactly how it feels. An office worker trapped in meaningless procedures reads The Trial and thinks, I know that system. Someone struggling with depression reads A Hunger Artist and thinks, that's my relationship with existence. The work keeps finding its readers because the conditions it describes keep recurring. Kafka wrote about his specific anxieties, his particular family, his personal inadequacies. But by going deep enough into the specific, he reached the universal. Everyone has felt like an insect. Everyone has faced arbitrary authority. Everyone has tried to reach something that remained forever inaccessible. His neuroses were unique. His honesty about them was universal. The disobedience that preserved the work raises questions we can't fully resolve. Artists destroy their work for reasons. Sometimes the reasons are good. Sometimes they're pathological. How do we tell the difference? Who gets to decide? Kafka said burn it. Brod said no. History sided with Brod. But that doesn't necessarily make him right. It just makes him successful. What we have is what survived. 3 unfinished novels, dozens of stories, mountains of letters and diaries, enough to build a reputation that has lasted a century and shows no signs of fading. Not bad for someone who published almost nothing and considered himself a failure. His father, Hermann, died in 1931, 7 years after Franz. He'd outlived his disappointing son. Whether he ever understood what Franz had accomplished, whether he read any of the posthumously published work, whether he felt pride or regret or simply indifference, nobody recorded. The dynamic between them was never resolved. Hermann remained the castle Franz could never reach. The 3 sisters died in the Holocaust. Ottla, Vali, Ellie, all 3 murdered in camps. Their brother had been dead 20 years by then, unable to imagine what was coming, but somehow having described its logic in advance. The bureaucratic machinery of genocide was the penal colony made real. The sisters disappeared into it like Joseph K. disappeared into the quarry. Dora Diamant survived, escaping to England, living until 1952. She never remarried. She spoke about Kafka occasionally, describing their year together in Berlin as happy despite the poverty and his dying. She kept some of his manuscripts, letters he'd written to her, fragments of unfinished stories. The Gestapo confiscated them in 1933 when they raided her apartment. Those pages are lost. We don't know what they contained. More nightmares, presumably. More precision. Max Brod lived until 1968, dying in Tel Aviv at 84. He spent 44 years promoting Kafka, longer than Kafka lived. Brod's own novels are forgotten. His plays aren't performed. His poetry isn't read. He survives only as Kafka's friend, the man who saved the work. That was enough. Some people's purpose is enabling someone else's genius. Brod fulfilled his purpose perfectly. The manuscripts Brod saved are scattered now across institutions, some in Oxford, some in Marbach, Germany. The Israeli National Library fought for years to acquire Brod's personal archive, claiming Kafka as Israeli cultural heritage, even though he never went there and died before the state existed. The legal battle lasted decades, archives and governments fighting over fragments. Kafka would have recognized the absurdity. Bureaucratic procedures determining the fate of papers written by someone who hated bureaucracy. You can see his handwriting in these archives. The letters are small, neat, obsessively regular. He revised constantly, crossing out words, rewriting sentences, never satisfied. The manuscripts are covered with corrections. This is what perfectionism looks like on the page. Every word questioned, every phrase tested, nothing accepted easily. That's why there are no bad Kafka stories. He threw out anything that didn't work. We only have what survived his own judgment, which was harsh. The published work represents a fraction of what he wrote. The rest was destroyed by him before he died, or would have been destroyed if Brod had obeyed. What remains is refined through constant doubt until only the essential survived. His grave in Prague's New Jewish Cemetery is simple. A white stone with his name and his parents' names. Visitors leave pebbles on it, the Jewish custom. The cemetery is peaceful. Trees shade the paths. Kafka is buried near his parents, the family reunited in death after decades of misunderstanding in life. Whether he'd want that proximity is unknowable. He had no choice in the matter. People visit the grave and take photos. They're paying respects to someone who shaped how they understand their own lives. That's what great writers do. They give you language for experiences you couldn't articulate. They show you patterns you couldn't see. They make you feel less alone in your confusion. Kafka made loneliness and inadequacy into literature. He transformed personal suffering into universal statement. He turned his neuroses into art that has mattered to millions. None of this made him happy. Success came after death. Recognition came too late to help. But the work exists. That's what survives. The question of what his life means is complicated by the fact that he considered it a failure. If we take him at his word, we're celebrating someone who died convinced he'd accomplished nothing. That should make us uncomfortable. Are we rescuing him from his own judgment or imposing our values on someone who rejected them? Maybe both, maybe neither. Maybe Kafka's self-assessment was accurate by his standards and wrong by ours. He wanted to finish the novels. He didn't. He wanted to marry and live normally. He couldn't. By those measures, he failed. But he created work that has resonated for a century and defined an entire mode of modern consciousness. By those measures, he succeeded extraordinarily. The contradiction sits there, unresolved, Kafkaesque in its own right. Success and failure occupying the same space, both true simultaneously. No way to reconcile them, just the reality of a life that was miserable and productive, trapped and free, wasted and essential. His writing desk is in a museum now. Small, wooden, nothing special. He sat there night after night, exhausted from the insurance work, stealing hours from sleep to write stories about people trapped in impossible situations. The desk was his burrow, his refuge, his prison. The place where he felt most himself and most inadequate, where he created masterpieces he considered failures. That desk is where modernity gained consciousness of its own nightmares, where bureaucratic horror was first articulated with perfect clarity, where alienation found its voice. A small wooden desk in Prague where an insurance clerk worked after hours, trying to capture something true, never quite satisfied, dying young, wanting it all destroyed. The fact that we're still reading him means something about the work's power. It also means something about our world. We keep reading Kafka because we keep living in situations he described. The alienation hasn't diminished. The bureaucracy hasn't improved. The systems have grown larger and more complex. We need his work more now than when he wrote it. That's his legacy, not the tourist industry or the academic interpretations or the adjective in every language. The actual work, the stories and novels that remain disturbing and precise and inexhaustibly meaningful. Words on pages that capture something permanent about being human under conditions of modernity that keep intensifying rather than resolving. You can read him now, a century later, and find your own life in his sentences. That's what matters. That's what survived. Not the man, who was miserable and died young. Not his intentions, which included destroying everything, but the work itself, rescued by betrayal, speaking across time to anyone who has felt trapped, guilty, inadequate, or caught in systems they never designed and cannot escape. The insurance clerk from Prague who wanted to be forgotten became immortal. The writer who felt like a failure created something indestructible. His nightmares became our vocabulary. His precision became our standard. His unfinished novels became complete statements about incompleteness. Everything he wanted to destroy became what he's remembered for. That's the final irony, and it's perfectly Kafkaesque.